Part 1, Chapter 4, Section 25. A player's motives criticized in a specimen game. Now that a few of my games with my own notes have been given, I offer for close perusal and study a very fine game played by Sir George Thomas, one of England's foremost players, against Mr. FFL Alexander, in the championship of the City of London Chess Club in the winter of 1919-1920. It has the interesting feature for the student that Sir George Thomas kindly wrote the notes to the game for me at my request, and with the understanding that I would make the comments on them that I considered appropriate. Sir George Thomas's notes are in the brackets and thus will be distinguished from my own comments. Example 55. Queen's Gambit declined. White, Mr. FFL Alexander. Black, Sir George Thomas. D4, D5, Knight F3, Knight F6, C4, E6, Knight C3, Knight B, D7, Bishop G5, C6, E3, Queen A5. Thomas says, quote, "One of the objects of Black's method of defense is to attack White's queen-knight doubly by knight e4, followed by d takes c4. But knight d2 is probably a strong way of meeting this threat." End quotes. There are, besides, two good reasons for this method of defense. First, that it is not as much played as some of the other defenses, and consequently not so well known. And second, that it leaves Black with two bishops against bishop and knight, which, in a general way, constitutes an advantage. Bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, a3, knight e4, queen b3, bishop e7. This is not the logical place for the bishop, which should have been posted at d6. In the opening, time is of great importance, and therefore the player should be extremely careful in his development and make sure that he posts his pieces in the right places. Bishop d3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, bishop f6. Thomas says, quote, "I did not want White's knight to come to e5, from where I could not dislodge it by f7 to f6 without weakening my e-pawn." End quotes. The same result could be accomplished by playing bishop d6. Incidentally, it bears out my previous statement that the bishop should have been originally played to d6. Castles. The alternative was e4 followed by e4 to e5 and then castles. White would thereby assume the initiative but would weaken his pawn position considerably and might be compelled to stake all on a violent attack against the king. This is a turning point in the game, and it is in such positions that the temperament and style of the player decide the course of the game. Castles. e4, e5, d5. Thomas says, quote, "White might play rook f d1, keeping the option of breaking up the center later on. I wanted him to advance this pawn as there is now a fine post for my bishop at c4. By this move, White shows that he does not understand the true value of his position. His only advantage consisted in the undeveloped condition of Black's queen bishop. He should therefore have made a plan to prevent the b from coming out, or if that were not possible, then he should try to force Black to weaken his pawn position in order to come out with the b. There were three moves to consider. First, a4, in order to maintain the white bishop in the dominating position that it now occupies. This would have been met by queen c7. Second, either of the rooks to d1. Rook a, d1, in order to threaten d takes e5, bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop takes f7 check. This would have been met by bishop g4, and third, h3 to prevent bishop g4 and by playing either rook to d1, followed up as previously stated to force black to play b7 to b5, which would weaken his queenside pawns. Thus, by playing h3, white would have attained the desired object. The text move blocks the action of the white bishop and facilitates black's development. Hereafter, white will act on the defensive, and the interest throughout the rest of the game will center mainly on black's play and the manner in which he carries out the attack. Queen c7, bishop d3. Thomas says, quote, "This seems wrong, as it makes the development of black's queen wing easier. At present, he cannot play b7 to b6 because of the reply d takes c6, followed by bishop d5, end quote. b6, c4, bishop b7, rook f, c1. Thomas says, quote, with the idea of rook a, b1, and c5. But it only compels black to bring his bishop to c5, which he would do in any case. Bishop b7, rook c2, bishop c5, queen b2, f6. Thomas says, quote, it would have been better probably to play rook f e8 with the idea of f7 to f5 presently, end quote. Black's play hereabout is weak. It lacks force, and there seems to be no well-defined plan of attack. It is true that these are the most difficult positions to handle in a game. In such cases, a player must conceive a plan on a large scale, which promises chances of success, and with it all, it must be a plan that could be carried out with the means at his disposal. From the look of the position, it seems that black's best chance would be to mass his forces for an attack against white's center, to be followed by a direct attack against the king. He should therefore play rook a e8, threatening f5. If white is able to defeat this plan, or rather to prevent it, then, once he has fixed some of the white pieces on the king's side, he should quickly shift his attack to the queen's side, and open a line for his rooks, which, once they enter action, should produce an advantage on account of the greater power of the two bishops. Rook b1, rook a d8, a4, bishop a6, rook d1. Thomas says, white has clearly lost time with his rook's moves. Rook f e8, queen b3. He also says, to bring his queen across after knight h4 and bishop e2. Rook d6, knight h4, g6, bishop e2, c takes d5. Thomas says, I thought this exchange necessary here, as white is threatening to play his bishop via g4 to e6. If he retook with the bishop's pawn, I intended to exchange bishops and rely on the 2 pawns to 1 on the queen's wing. I did not expect him to retake it with the king's pawn, which seemed to expose him to a violent kingside attack. End quotes. Black's judgment in this instance I believe to be faulty. Had white retaken with the bishop's pawn, as he expected, he would have had the worst of the pawn position, as white would have had a passed pawn well supported on the queen's side. His only advantage would lie in his having a very well posted bishop against a badly posted knight, and on the fact in such positions as the above, the bishop is invariably stronger than the knight. He could and should have prevented all that by playing bishop c8, as, had white then replied with queen g3, he could then play c takes d5, and white would have not been able to retake with the c takes d5 on account of bishop takes f2 check, winning the exchange. E takes d5, e4, g3, e3. I do not like this move. It would have been better to hold it in reserve and to have played f5, to be followed in due time by g6 to g5 and f5 to f4, after having placed the queen at d7, f7, or some other square as the occasion demanded. The text move blocks the action of the powerful bishop at c5 and tends to make white's position safer than it should have been. The move in itself is a very strong attacking move, but it is isolated and there is no effective continuation. Such advances, as a rule, should only be made when they can be followed by a concerted action of the pieces. f4, bishop c8, knight f3, bishop f5, rook b2, rook e4, king g2, queen c8, knight g1, g5. Thomas says if now bishop f3, then g takes f4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4 check with a winning attack. F takes g5, f takes g5, rook f1, g4. Rook h6 was the alternative. White's only move would have been king h1. The position now is evidently won for black, and it is only a question of finding the right course. The final attack is now carried on by Sir George Thomas in an irreproachable manner. Bishop d3, rook f6, knight e2, queen f8. Thomas says, quote, again preventing bishop takes e4 by the masked attack on white's rook. White therefore protects his rook, end quotes. If knight f4, then e2, knight takes e2, rook takes e2, check, rook takes e2, bishop e4 check, brilliant move, bishop takes e4, best, rook takes f1, and white is lost. If, however, against knight f4, black plays queen h6 and white queen c2, I take pleasure in offering the position to my readers as a most beautiful and extraordinary win for black, beginning with queen h3 check, brilliant move. I leave the variations for the student to work out. Rook b, b1, queen h6, queen c2. Thomas says, quote, making a double attack on the rook, which still cannot be taken, and preparing to defend the h-pawn, end quotes. If either the rook or bishop are taken, white would be mated in a few moves. Queen h3 check, king h1, rook takes c4, brilliant move. Thomas says, quote, if rook h6, then knight g1, queen takes g3, queen g2. Black therefore tries to get the queen away from the defense, end quotes. A very beautiful move and the best way to carry on the attack. Queen takes c4. Thomas says the best defense was rook takes f5, but black would emerge with queen against rook and a knight. Bishop takes d3. Thomas again says, again, not rook h6 because of d6 check. Rook takes f6. Thomas says, if queen takes d3, then at last, rook h6 wins. Bishop takes c4, knight f4, e2. Thomas says, queen has no escape, but white has no time to take it. Rook g1, queen f1, white resigns, a very fine finish.